Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Stewart-Williams. He is Associate Professor of Psychology at Nottingham University Malaysia Campus. His research revolves around the idea that theories from evolutionary biology can shed light on human psychology. In particular, he is interested in the evolutionary origins of altruistic behavior and human sex differences. He also has a long-standing interest in the philosophical implications of evolutionary theory. And finally, is also the author of books like Darwin, God and the Meaning of Life, and more recently, The Ape That Understood the Universe. So, Dr. Stewart-Williams, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
You're very welcome, Ricardo. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so it's interesting that in your most recent book, that will be the main subject of our discussion today, you really make the case to going back to the basics of evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology. And so I guess that we could start off by discussing a little bit the questions surrounding the unit and the levels of selection in natural selection, right? Because, I mean, sometimes the discussion gets a little difficult because particularly since Richard Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene, it seems that people have been putting a lot of emphasis on the gene being the unit of selection instead of the individual or the kin or the group. But what would you have to say about that? What is important for us to know about that question?
Well, I think if we're talking about sort of long-term adaptive evolution, there is quite a good reason to put that emphasis on the gene and to consider the gene to be sort of the main unit of selection. The main reason to do that, I think, is that when it comes to reproduction and evolution, the gene is the thing that's getting copied. Genes get copied, right? So different gene variants can increase in frequency or they can decrease in frequency. They can be selected or selected against. Now, that's not the case with individuals, and that's not the case with groups. So individuals don't literally copy themselves. They don't make replicas of themselves. Likewise with groups, they don't copy themselves. Ecosystems, species, they don't make copies of themselves. They're affected by natural selection, but I think it's fair to say that it's primarily natural selection of genes sort of, in effect, indirectly affects individuals, indirectly affects groups. So I think for that reason, it's good to think of the gene as the unit of selection. And I think it ties in as well with the idea that that the traits are selected to the extent that they're good for the genes that help give rise to those traits. Okay, so the natural selection favors genes that, in effect, look after themselves and promote their own continuance in the gene pool. So that's what that means is that traits are selected that are not necessarily good for the individual. Now often they are. So they're good for the individual in terms of their reproductive success. Genes can be selected for that reason. Sometimes, though, you'll get traits that are not good for the individual, that instead, the individual might help its offspring, or might help other close relatives, or even more distant relatives. It might help them even at a cost to itself. So it's not for the good of the individual in terms of reproductive success. It's for the good of other individuals. What's the common denominator? I think it's the fact that it's for the good of the genes that underpin the traits in question. So it's another reason. If selection happens at the level of the group, that's a big if, but if it does, then I think that involves the selection of genes as well. So genes that give rise to group beneficial traits, those genes are only going to proliferate if the group beneficial traits are better for the gene than competing alleles that are less good for the group. So again, it ultimately, I think, comes down to the level of the gene, and I think for those are the reasons I'd say that it's best to think of the gene as the unit of selection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the gene as the unit of selection, but do you agree with multi-level selection theory? That is, that selection occurs at several different levels, like, for example, the gene, the individual, the kin, and, of course, you already
maybe
referred briefly to the group, and that's a bit contentious topic, but do you agree with that we can really look at it at occurring at several different levels?
Yes and no. I think probably I wouldn't say I'm an advocate of multi-level selection, just because I think that ultimately it does come down to the selection of groups. Now, that can take place at the level of individuals. So if it's good for the individual, the genes might be selected. If it's good for the group, maybe the genes might be selected. But again, I think the genes, just because the genes are the unit of heredity, and therefore they're the things that can increase or decrease in frequency. For that reason, they do have to be considered somewhat special. And so I don't really agree with the strand of multi-level selection theory that says that genes are one level, individuals are another level, the group is another level, they're all on equal footing. I think that even though you do get selection sort of at the level of the individual or the group, that ultimately does boil down to selection among genes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and even when we're talking about, for example, kin selection, it stems from genetic relatedness, right? That is, there are the same copies of the same gene in different individuals, and there's also where altruism stems from primarily. Right.
Indeed, yeah. Well, kin altruism anyway, yeah. So a very important category of altruism does come from that. It does come from the fact that genes are being advantaged by this individual level altruism. Now you could say that it's for the good of the individual at the level of inclusive fitness. So inclusive fitness is more than just sort of Darwinian fitness. Darwinian fitness is just reproductive success, but inclusive fitness includes that, but it also includes the individual's contribution to the reproductive success of kin, which is what you're talking about, right? So it includes both of those things, inclusive fitness. But even then, I'd say that really inclusive fitness is another way of just saying that it's ultimately for the good of the genes that certain traits get selected. And I'd add to that there are cases where you get genes that come along that can be selected that actually don't benefit the inclusive fitness of the individual. So for instance, there are what are called segregation distorted genes. So these are genes that they come along. Now most genes, right, they have a 50-50 chance of being copied into any offspring that's produced. Segregation distorted genes are kind of outlaw genes. They come along, they cheat the system, and they have effects that make it more likely than 50-50 that they'll get into any offspring that gets produced. That benefits them. Obviously, they're going to be selected over competing alleles, but that can happen even if it has no effect at all on the inclusive fitness of the organism. And in some cases, it can actually be disadvantageous to the inclusive fitness of the organism, which suggests, I think, that actually this gene's eye view, this is what we're talking about, the gene's eye view of evolution, it's actually more accurate than the inclusive fitness picture, just because it explains everything the inclusive fitness can explain. So stuff that benefits the self, stuff that benefits kin, but it can also explain things that the inclusive fitness theory cannot explain, such as segregation distorted genes, selfish genetic elements, and the like.
Mm-hmm. And just to make this point clear, when we talk about reciprocal altruism as proposed first by Robert Rivers, I think, does it have any influence in how we look at the levels of selection or not?
Well, in terms of inclusive fitness theory, that would be at the level of direct fitness, so that is advantaging the individual rather than kin. You can construe it in terms of multi-level selection. So some folks they've done that. Instead of construing it in terms of inclusive fitness, you can think of reciprocal altruism in terms of groups, i.e. a two-person group, like two individuals as they're reciprocating. In that moment of time, we consider them to be a group that's doing better than non-reciprocating groups. That does work. The mathematics of that work. I don't think it's as intuitive a way to construe things. I think usually we think of groups as being sort of relatively distinct, like geographically delineated clusters of individuals, rather than just sort of a two-person group while you're reciprocating, and then that individual goes away, and suddenly there's another two-person group here while we're reciprocating. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And about cultural selection, I mean, should we deal with culture as being something separate from our biology and that operates in parallel with it, and that even adds another level of selection? Or I mean, how should we deal with culture in this picture of how it might, the interplay it might have with biological evolution?
Well, I think that we do have to think of biological evolution and cultural evolution as separate things, separate processes. They do interact with one another, but they are conceptually distinct. So, and the main distinction is that when you talk about biological evolution, and adaptive evolution, you're talking primarily about selection among competing gene variants, whereas when you're talking about cultural evolution, you're talking about selection among cultural variants. So some cultural, or means, if you like. So some cultural variants do better and better than, and are selected within the culture. Some disappear from the culture, and they have ups and downs, etc. But the key thing is that we're talking about different things. So like some of the factors that shape biological evolution are similar to the ones that shape cultural evolution. There's some sort of blind selection going on in both cases. Some of the factors are different. There's a lot, I think in cultural evolution there's a lot more deliberate creation and deliberate direction going on than in biological evolution. But even if the factors were absolutely identical, that the factors that shape biological versus cultural evolution, even if they were identical, I think it would still make sense to separate the two and to consider them separately, just because we're talking about the evolution of different entities. We're talking about the evolution of biological entities versus cultural stuff. Those are different things. Now, they certainly interact with each other in important ways. So if culture, for instance, has to sort of evolve to mesh with human nature, and like cuisines, for instance, have to evolve to push the right buttons in terms of the kind of foods that we like. Stories, movies, art forms, things like that, they have to be about stuff that humans are naturally interested in, right? Like love and betrayal and aggression and that kind of stuff, rather than I don't know, wallpaper and rocks and pebbles and things. We're more naturally interested in some things than others. Cultural evolution has to mesh with human nature, our evolved nature in that way. And of course, you also get another kind of very important kind of long-term interaction, which is gene-culture co-evolution. So certain sort of long-standing cultural elements can if they persist for long enough, they can create selection pressures that can then change our actual biological nature. Classic example, as I'm sure you know, is the evolution of lactose tolerance in populations that have a long history of living with dairying animals, and they sort of start drinking the milk. Once they have this milk and they're drinking it, creates a selection pressure for an ability to digest the lactase in milk, to recreate lactase so you can digest the lactose in milk, the sugar in milk, and therefore get more nutrition out of the milk. And that's happened in various different populations that have a long history of doing that. Gene culture coevolution.
Mm-hmm. And to get into gene culture coevolution, I mean, their culture also has to have a part in our environment. That is, it has to turn into another environmental pressure that acts also on our genes and our biological evolution. So, was there any point in our evolutionary history where we can really say that we passed a certain threshold where culture really started to be part of the environment?
It's tricky, right? I guess in a certain sense there must be. So I mean, you're right that the culture is not just part of the environment. It's one of the most important parts of our environment, I would say, and has been for quite a long time. And I guess there must have been some kind of transition, because at one stage, if you trace it back far enough, there were animals that ultimately evolved into us that basically didn't have culture. And then somewhere along the line, and now we do. Now we've got tons and tons of stuff, culture coming out of our ears, and somehow we got from point A to point B where we are now. It'd be impossible, I think, to pinpoint a moment where that transition happened. It's like everything in evolution. It's easy to say, here's point A, here's point B. These are clearly distinct. Somewhere in the middle, though, there must have been indeterminate stages where it's just difficult to say whether we're a cultural animal or not in these intermediate stages. Between the clear stages of definitely no culture, definitely tons of culture.
Yeah, right, because I mean it's a bit difficult because also to be able to create culture, we had to go through an evolutionary process where we acquired the necessary cognitive tools. And so even what we were able to create, I mean, it must have been some sort of point in our evolutionary history where we could say, okay, now we really already have the set of cognitive tools necessary to really create kinds of culture that distinguish us from other animals, because there are also other, particularly primates, that also show at least incipient forms of culture, correct?
That is correct, yeah. So chimpanzees, for instance, have various traditions. I think it's fair to say they have culture because they have not just one or two traditions, but just a bunch of traditions. Likewise, orangutans and gorillas, I think, and capuchin monkeys. Songbirds have some, certainly have traditions. I don't know, people might vary in terms of whether they say that those are cultural animals, but they certainly have traditions. Whales do as well. Lots of animals do. So there must have been some points. I wouldn't say there's a point. I'd say there were probably multiple points where different kind of cognitive faculties that make culture as we know it today possible were just sort of slowly coming online and being fine-tuned. And just over. Well, I mean, because we share it with so many other species, it must trace back, I would say, a long, long way. So over millions of years, and perhaps accelerating over the last few 100,000 years.
Mm-hmm. And what really distinguishes our ability to create culture from a culture that occurs in other animals? Would it be the fact that there's really a great distance in terms of our ability to accumulate culture and the ways by which we are able to evolve culture in comparison with other animals?
Yeah. I think that's probably the big thing, the really big difference, is that we do have this cumulative cultural evolution. I don't know, the example I like to use often is if you think about Plato and Aristotle, these great geniuses of the ancient world, I'm sure that they were probably vastly more intelligent in terms of just their raw processing ability, vastly more intelligent than the vast majority of people living today. The vast majority of people living today, though, have a much more accurate picture of the universe than did the greatest of these ancient Greek scholars. Kids even have a more accurate picture of the universe just because they know that we're living on a spinning ball that's going around this great big ball of fire. Plato and Aristotle didn't know that. It's not that our species has evolved to be smarter. We're basically the same animal that we were back then. It's purely a result of the fact that we have this capacity to stockpile knowledge and to kind of pass it down through the generations, and we can tinker with it and we can fine-tune it over time. That's the big difference. Now, it's been argued that chimpanzees probably have a little bit of cumulative culture. So their ability, their very famous cultural tradition of taking a couple of rocks, put a nut in its shell on top of one rock and then crack it open very gently enough that you can open it up without smashing the whole thing. That's one of their more impressive cultural traditions. Probably didn't evolve all in one step, like one sort of genius Einstein chimpanzee suddenly inventing the whole thing from nothing. Franz de Waal and others have argued that there were probably a few stages along the way to get in that tradition. So maybe a little bit of cumulative culture in some other species. But even that, it's just nowhere near on the scale of what you see in our species. It's just a vast accumulation of all sorts of different cultural traditions in our lineage.
Mm-hmm. And that's also why in humans there are people that talk about dual inheritance theory, right? That is that we inherit our genes, particularly from our parents, but also the culture that is part of our group in this case, right?
Sorry, say that again. Was that the extended phenotype, did you say?
Not exactly. I was referring to dual inheritance theory. That is that we inherit both our genes and also the culture that is part of the group we live in.
Oh, I see. Okay, the dual inheritance, so the two sort of co-evolving along with each other.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I like that dual inheritance theory. Is one. So the big chapter I have on on cultural evolution draws heavily on dual inheritance theory, the work of course, Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson initially, and work of other individuals, Joseph Heinrich and Richard McElrath. It's good stuff, right? So the idea that we have sort of learning biases that kind of lead us to gravitate toward adaptive memes, if you like. I think they wouldn't like that, by the way. I don't think they don't like the term meme, but I do quite like the whole meme idea, and so I'm happy to use that term. We gravitate toward more adaptive cultural variance, though, if you prefer. Gene culture coevolution, also cultural group selection. They talk about. I think we possibly have some of that going on as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that's interesting because at the cultural level, we can really say that we have group selection occurring.
I think it's definitely possible, yeah. Like, I'm not 100% convinced that it happens, but I do think it's plausible. I think it's a lot more plausible than genetic group selection, just because of the fact that I think with biological evolution, individuals can reproduce just a lot more quickly than groups can, and so you just have much more rapid individual level selection operating on genes. But it's a bit different with culture. You can get cultural group selection happening much more quickly.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that then culture what would it really do? Culture would piggyback on the biological basis that we have to establish reciprocal relationships with other people and expand our group identities or something like that?
I think it does some of that. I think it probably does a lot of things. I think it piggybacks on all sorts of different adaptations. And I tend to think that just probably, in some sense, just the basic capacity for culture in a very general sense, it's adaptive for human beings, or it certainly was, particularly was when it first evolved. It was adaptive. That's why, like in a sense, it must have been, right? For it to evolve in the first place, it must have, at least on average, enhance people's inclusive fitness as it was evolving. I think there's a good case to be made that having evolved, it's kind of such an open-ended system that can piggyback on so many other different things, different aspects of human nature. It's a good case to be made that it's kind of come off the genetic leash, and so we get the evolution of cultural stuff that is not necessarily adaptive. Okay, so some stuff clearly is. It's adaptive for the individuals. Some stuff might be adaptive at the group level, but there's plenty of stuff that I think that evolves, which is not adaptive for either the individual or the group, and it really sort of sticks around in the culture purely because it's good at sticking around. It's catchy, or it's just sort of contagious in some way, that even if it's not good for us, we want to keep it in the culture. And in fact, we don't even necessarily want to keep it in the culture, but it sticks around anyway. Like, so the classic example, right, is earworms. So really, really catchy tunes that we get stuck in our minds, and they keep going on and on and on in our minds, and we don't want them. And but they do. They get stuck, and they get stuck. They're little cultural variants that not good for us, not good for the group. They're just good for themselves. They perpetuate themselves in our minds. We whistle them and or hum them or whatever, and other people pick them up, and then they have them on their minds, and they spread.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's move on to another topic, because I mean, when people think about evolution, the first thing that comes to mind is natural selection, but there's another thing, another phenomenon that also occurs in sexually reproducing species, that is sexual selection, and even Darwin already talked a little bit about this. So could you tell us what is the importance that sexual selection has for us to better understand our evolutionary history, and particularly how our psychological traits evolved?
Yeah, so sexual selection is usually viewed as a form of natural selection, but it's selection for, instead of survival, selection for traits that enhance reproductive success, usually either through attracting mates or through outperforming and outcompeting same-sex rivals. So those are the two sort of aspects. And Darwin he said quite a lot about it. In fact, he sort of introduced the idea, and later on, after quite a big gap where people biologists didn't talk about it that much, some of them, Robert Trivers, for instance, picked up the ball and kept running with that sexual selection ball. Very, very important selection pressure in terms of shaping our species, shaping average differences between the sexes. as well.
Okay, and before we get into sex differences, in your book at a certain point you say that reproduction is more important than survival in evolution. Could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of people think that evolution is about the survival of the fittest. Okay, so that's a phrase came originally from the philosopher Herbert Spencer. Darwin picked it up later on in his life. Survival of the fittest, sort of emphasis on survival. But actually, if you imagine an organism that came along and it lived for 1,000 years, or it lived for 10,000 years, or 100,000 years, if it never had any offspring or passed on its genes in any kind of way, then the instant that individual, as good as it was at surviving, the instant that it died, its genes would be wiped off the face of the planet. So basically, if you survival, no matter how long you survive, if you want your genes to go forward, you have to act in certain ways that make the genes go forward, the most common of which is to reproduce, although you can also help close relatives to reproduce as well. So survival is important. So you do have to survive for long enough to pass on your genes. But survival isn't like an end in itself in evolutionary terms. It's a means to another end. That end is passing on one's genes. The most common way that that's done by most organisms, ourselves included, is by having offspring. So you survive for long enough to have offspring. And in fact, those two things, survival and reproduction, they trade off against each other to some degree, with reproduction often trumping survival. Classic example would be the peacock's tail. The peacock's tail is huge, colourful, ornately patterned tail that the males of the species sport, and then they walk around with these great tails. The tails, if anything, they decrease their survival prospects because they're very, very costly to grow. They just like a huge beacon that attracts predators to come along, and also when those predators do come along, it's very, very hard for the peacock to escape because it's got this massive, apparently pointlessly large, pretty tail that it's lugging with it. And the reason, though, that it was selected is because it's not actually pointless. It doesn't help survival, but it does help reproductive success. The reason being that peahens prefer to mate with males that have larger, more colourful, more ornately patterned tails. So it boosts reproductive success at a cost to survival. And that sort of demonstrates the point that it's not actually survival, but it's actually reproductive success or some other way of passing on one's genes that counts in evolutionary terms.
Okay, and what are the biological bases for sex differences, particularly in humans? Because we've already talked about sexual selection here, and I mean, where should we start off from? Should we go back to physiological differences in terms of reproduction at the level of the gametes, that is, eggs being more costly to produce than sperm, and men producing much more sperm than women do eggs during their lifetime? Or should we start with parental investment theory? Where exactly?
Well, I think we need to go beyond the sex cells, the gametes, the sperm and eggs, except for the simplest animals, which just don't provide any other form of parental investment. For them, you can understand sex differences in terms of sperm and egg, but for most species, if they provide any more parental investment, you have to look at that. So it was based the idea that it all comes down to gametes, that sex difference comes down to the gametes. That was Bateman's idea back in 1948, but that was kind of trumped by the work of Trivers in 1972, his parental investment theory, and then subsequent kind of refinements of that theory by folks like Clutton-Brock and Vincent. I think the clearest way, so parental investment is really important, but I think the clearest way to capture the idea, in my view, is in terms of like sex differences and the maximum number of offspring that each sex can produce. So, on average, the number of offspring that each sex can produce has to be about the same in a species where there are 50-50 roughly males and females. The average has to be the same, but the spread, the variance can be greater for one sex or the other, such that the maximum number can be higher for one sex or the other. And usually where you get that kind of difference, which you often do, usually it's the males that can have the higher maximum number of offspring. And where that's the case, it creates a whole bunch of different selection pressures on the males than it does on the females, because they potentially, like males, potentially have tons and tons of offspring. So it creates a selection pressure, for instance, for them to try to do so. So if you imagine, so imagine like typical mammalian species. You have females who, as well as providing the egg is in effect the least of their worries when they're in terms of parental investment. They get pregnant, they have to carry the offspring, they have to go through the physical trauma of giving birth to the offspring. They then have to nurse it for a period of time as well. That's what female mammals do. The males, on the other hand, obviously have to do very much less than that. The sort of minimum investment of a male mammal is much, much less. And so you can imagine that with mammals in general, humans as well, if you imagine that if a male were to mate with, I don't know, say 5 females in the course of a single year, potentially he could have five offspring, or 5 litters of offspring from each of the different females. But if, on the other hand, a female were to mate with 5 different males, she's probably going to have no more offspring than she would if she'd only mated with one within that year period, or within a reproductive cycle. So there's a stronger selection pressure on males, typically, to seek out multiple mates, for instance. Stronger on males than on females. The prize is bigger for males who have multiple mates, so there's more competition within, like among males, between themselves, to win that prize. So you have greater competition among them, and more aggression among them, and more of a tendency to take risks among the males. Now, this does happen in humans as well, and I think people listening to this are going to recognize that there are tendencies in that direction, not just in non-human mammals, but in our species as well. I think it's fair to say that the differences in our species are somewhat smaller than is the case in probably most mammals. They're somewhat smaller because, although the minimum amount of investment in offspring for human males is much lower than the minimum for females to produce one offspring, the typical amount is somewhat higher. And that reduces the gap in terms of the sort of maximum number of offspring that males can produce versus females. By reducing that, it reduces the magnitude of the sex differences to some degree. They're certainly still there, though. It is certainly still the case that, on average, that males are more interested in casual sex and sexual variety than are females, that they're more aggressive on average than are females, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And is it also the case that in humans, in comparison with other mammals, we have more parental investment by males, because human infants also go through longer periods of dependency, and so if they weren't to really invest a lot on their offspring, perhaps their reproductive success, even if they were to impregnate several females, would drop because the children wouldn't survive. Is that something like that?
I think that probably is the reason that we have sort of atypically high levels of male parental investment in our species, atypical for mammals. I think it's exactly that. I think it's the fact that our infants are born in like a really, really helpless, completely dependent state, and they stay in that state for quite a few years. And then even after that, they take a lot longer to reach like nutritional independence than do the young of, I think, pretty much any other species. They take, even in like a relatively traditional society, they can take roughly 18 years, 20 years, something like that. Even in a hunter-gatherer society, or a hunter-gatherer, horticulturalist society. So for both of those reasons, it takes just a lot of investment to create a new human, like a lot more than a single female by herself could achieve. So for that reason, in our species, we seem to have really high levels of what's called allomaternal care. So that's care from, not just from males, but just from individuals other than the female herself. In most species, most mammals, the female alone, she can do it. That's the case of chimps and even individuals as close as chimps. Not the case for us, though. So you get various different individuals pitching in to look after the kids, grandmothers, usually particularly maternal grandmothers, aunts, grandaunts, sisters, friends of the mother, etc., etc. But also often males, also often the father in particular. Very commonly doesn't invest on average as much as females do across cultures, but it is very, very common for the males of human beings to invest in the young. And I think that is the reason that we evolved to form sort of relatively durable pair bonds for males to have a capacity to, in effect, fall in love with their kids and want to look after their kids and that kind of thing. And simultaneously reducing the size of some of the sex differences in our species as compared to what you see in other mammals.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but because even from a strictly biological perspective and from a perspective of biological evolution, for a particular individual to be successful, it is not only important for him or her to be able to survive until a reproductive age and to reproduce, but also to make sure that its offspring survives and also reproduces, right?
Exactly right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So now to get a little bit more specifically into sexual psychological traits or sex differences between men and women in terms of their psychological traits. Okay, so I guess that one difficulty that we have here when we talk about this issue is that people tend to separate sex from gender, or the strictly physical traits from the psychological / behavioral ones. But should we really go that way? I mean, aren't psychological traits also part of our phenotype?
Yeah, they are, and I think I'm not a huge fan of the distinction between sex and gender for a few reasons. One is, well, there are a number of different definitions applied to gender for a start. So sometimes it just means like gender roles of a culture. That's what they're referring to. So, so the fact that, for instance, in the 1950s in the West, women didn't typically go to work, especially once they got married, whereas now the norm is completely flipped, and they typically do go to work when they're married. That sort of would be an example of a gender role. Society's gender roles. It's not what it always means, though, when people talk about gender. So often they are talking about psychology, and when they talk about gender differences, there's an implication that it's what I would call sex differences, but there's an implication that it's all down to culture. So they might say, so sex differences, when you talk about sex, you're talking about biology. When you talk about gender, you're talking about culture. And I don't think that's a good way to think about it, really, for a number of reasons. One is that the kind of differences that we're talking about, when we're talking about, say, differences between men and women on average in terms of aggression, say, that's affected by nature and by nurture. It's both. And so if you want to say that's a gender, so you can't really say it's a gender difference. And if you insist on the distinction between gender differences and sex differences, it's neither, right? Or if you like, it's both. So it's part gender difference and part sex difference, which is a really awkward way to construe it. I think it's like a better way to construe it would be to say, just to talk about that we have these differences that are correlated with biological sex, and in labeling it that way, and the label itself just be neutral about the origins of those in terms of nature versus nurture. And having said we have these differences correlated with biological sex, we can then sort out. So to what extent is it nature? To what extent is it nurture? It's not going to be one or the other. And it's ironic, actually. So this distinction between gender differences and sex differences sort of implies like a complete, like a quite extreme nature-nurture dichotomy, which I just don't think applies to, it applies to any traits, it applies to very, very few traits. So I think instead we can talk about sex differences. We can say, for instance, there are sex differences that are largely nature, like the sex difference in terms of which sex people are sexually attracted to. There are sex differences which are much, much closer to the nurture end of the spectrum. I would put in that category the fact that boys might be dressed up in blue, girls in pink. Some folks have argued that there's actually some biological contribution to that. It doesn't strike me as particularly plausible that there is, but maybe there's a little bit. But I think either way, I think it's probably uncontroversial to say that that's a lot further toward the nurture end of the spectrum. Most differences, though, are going to be a combination of both. So I don't think it's appropriate to try to divide things into sex differences and gender differences. They're all a little mixture of both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and
Go ahead.
as we were talking about earlier, when we talked about biology and culture and the interplay between them, I mean, even when you were referring to right now to girls wearing pink and boys wearing blue, I mean, perhaps that's something that comes from culture, but even things that come from culture, I mean, they only turn into culture because something in our innate cognitive systems is able to process those kinds of informations in a biologically plausible way, something like that, right?
True, but I mean, I guess that some aspects of culture are more arbitrary than others. So there are certain names that are given to boys more often than girls, and I think in most cases it's just arbitrary. It could have just as well have gone the other way around. So I noticed that. So like living here in Malaysia, like a lot of the students at the university, they're from other cultures. They're Chinese or they're Malay, and when I was sort of first encountering some of the first names, I couldn't really tell, but before I met the person, I couldn't really tell which were male names and which were female names. So I think there is some arbitrariness, and some things just seem to be linked to male biological sex and female biological sex just completely arbitrarily, and could just as easily have gone the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in that sense, would you say that gender, and because when people use the word gender, they immediately create a dichotomy there between what is strictly biologically sex and something that happens at the level of culture? Would you say that that term is even scientifically useful, also because of the huge and complicated interplay that we have between culture and biology?
I think probably not. I think probably not because partly because of the vagueness of the way that the term is used, partly because of the fact that it seems to rest on a strict, you can divide things into nature or nurture, which it's almost never the case. So I think for both of those reasons, it's not particularly useful. I tend to, I'm not averse to saying gender, but I tended to use it when I'm talking about gender differences. I'm using it as synonymous with sex differences. I guess one other meaning we haven't touched on already of what gender can mean is it can refer to people's sense of themselves as being male or female.
Right.
And people do have that kind of sense, and sometimes it mismatches with their biological, like their anatomical structure. So I think because they do have that sense, we need a term for it to be able to discuss it. I think probably calling it gender identity is clearer. So we're not using the same single word for multiple different things. So gender identity, I think, is more useful to use there.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are perhaps the main flaws when we try to explain sex differences purely from a sociological or sociocultural perspective?
I think the main flaw with that, with explaining it 100%. So let me just be clear at that. I do think that sociological and sociocultural explanations are important, and they're an important piece of the puzzle. The people who looked at those kind of things come up with plenty of good insights. But with your question, right, you're asking if we just want to explain everything in terms of sociocultural factors, what's the main problem there? And I think it's simple. I think the main problem with it is just that it's simply not the case. That the sex differences we're talking about are just purely product of social cultural forces. So that's the main thing. It's just not true. It's not the case. How do we know it's not the case? With sex differences, there are various sort of converging lines of evidence that suggest not that it's all down to nurture. Not that it's all down to nature. They suggest, though, that nature's part of it. It's not all down to nurture, in other words. So, for instance, you have evidence of cross-cultural universality of certain kinds of sex differences. If there was no innate contribution here, if it was all down to culture, I think you would expect even more variation across cultures than you actually see. There's evidence that certain sex differences persist even in the face of quite strong social pressure to eradicate them. There's evidence that certain sex differences, certain traits that we're talking about, like interest in casual sex, sex drive, aggression, parental inclinations, these kind of things correlate with prenatal hormonal levels. Testosterone, for instance, is linked with these sort of stereotypically male traits. Lower levels are linked with stereotypically female traits, parenting and the like, within each sex. And then, of course, you have the average difference in prenatal and postnatal hormonal levels between the sexes. And then one other, I think, quite important line of evidence that it's not all just nurture is the fact that you see sex differences similar to the ones that you see in humans. You see them as well in other animals. You don't see them in every other species, but importantly, you see them in other species that resemble us in evolutionarily relevant ways. So specifically, you see them in species where the maximum number of offspring is higher for the males than for the females. And then the sort of cluster of sex differences that we have, you find them clustered together across species that have that difference in maximum sex difference and maximum offspring number.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting because you referred to at a certain point there to cross-cultural variation, and if something was to be explained purely on cultural terms, then we would probably get a much higher variation among cultures and things like that. But I mean, that's another interesting point, because culture and cultural variation also doesn't occur randomly, right? It tends to follow certain predictable tracts, let's say, because I mean, what I want to say here is probably that there are, when people look at different cultures that are different from their own, it's much easier for us to see the differences and do not really see the similarities. But when we really employ scientifically rigorous methods to really study human behavior in our own culture and in other cultures, we get a lot of human universals, right?
That is right, yeah. So I mean, there is a mix of universals and differences among cultures, but I guess you do get universals. So yeah, I mean, you're right. So not all universals are necessarily going to be a product of natural selection. You could have some sort of game theoretical stuff where you get universals just because there are certain ways to organize societies that are the only ways to do it. You will have societies, for instance, where you'll have cars driving on the left-hand side of the road, others where they're driving on the right-hand side of the road. But you won't be able to have a culture that has cars in any significant numbers where you don't have either one of those two rules, right? And that's not because there's an innate tendency to choose one of those two rules. It's just because it's the only way to organize a society that has a significant number of cars. You have to choose one of those options. So yeah, I do agree that you can get universals that are not direct products of natural selection. And the evidence across cultural universality, I guess, is suggestive of an innate contribution, in the case of sex differences and kin altruism, that kind of thing. By itself doesn't clinch the deal. I think what does make it a whole bunch more plausible that these things do have an evolutionary origin is that it's not just the cross-cultural universality. It's these multiple different lines of evidence, including cross-species evidence, hormonal evidence, evidence that these things survive even in the face of social pressure pushing them in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've been criticizing here pure sociocultural approaches to sex differences, but I also wanted to talk with you about a piece of work that you've done with Andrew Thomas, who I've already had on the show, about okay, I will put it this way, and if I say something wrong, please correct me, that it is still very prevalent in evolutionary psychology to use the model of males compete and females choose to talk about human mating behavior. But you together with Andrew Thomas proposed that perhaps the best model is, at least in humans, the one of mutual mate choice. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's basically right. So there's a model of sexual selection that says that males compete, females choose. That does apply to a lot of species, right? So peacocks, for instance, talked about earlier, the males compete with each other with their extravagant displays. The females choose from among the males on offer. The males do basically all of the competing, the females do basically all of the choosing. Now, that's not the case for our species. Males and females compete for mates. Males may compete on average more fervently and more recklessly in some cases, but nonetheless, it's not the case that one sex does it and the other doesn't. We're talking about a difference in the average level to which it's done. Likewise, with mate choice, it's not the case that females choose and males don't. Both sexes have mate preferences, like especially in long-term relationships. Both sexes are quite choosy about their long-term mates in particular. Now, what we argued was it wasn't exactly that evolutionary psychologists adopt the MCFC model and they're wrong to do so, and we've got a whole new model that you've never thought of, which is the mutual mate choice model. We weren't saying that. Instead, our argument was a little subtler. It was basically that within the evolutionary psychology literature, you get some sort of claims made that kind of fit in with the MCFC model. Males compete, females choose. Plenty of claims as well that fit with the MMC model, the mutual mate choice model. So plenty of claims about both sexes having mate preferences, both sexes competing, and that kind of thing. But you do get elements of both. And what we were pointing out was first of all the fact that you do get both. Second, that those two ways of construing human beings, sexual psychology, kind of conflict with each other. And there's a sort of unnoticed contradiction in the evolutionary psych literature. And then finally, that the MMC approach, the mutual mate choice, is more accurate than the males compete, females choose approach. So that was our argument. You do see that. So just I'll give you a few examples of the MCFC trend, just so it doesn't sound so it's clear I'm not tilting it at windmills. So an example might be, for instance, in terms of sort of an overemphasis on female choice, mate choice, as opposed to male choice, there have been lots of studies that have looked at intelligence as a mating display and humor as a mating display, and MHC alleles and that kind of thing that have only looked at female preferences for those traits in males and not the reverse. As if we were the kind of species where females are doing all the choosing and males are doing all the displaying. So there's a sort of subtle indication that there's an MCFC kind of view of our species operating in the background of people's thinking. Another example is the much stronger sort of emphasis on male competition among mates than among female competition. Various people have addressed that, but there was sort of a gap in the literature that's been addressed. So that's what we argued.
Okay, and thank you for clarifying, because perhaps I didn't phrase it really the correct way. So, but again about mating systems and human mating is it really possible for us to say that humans have a preferred mating system, like, for example, monogamy, polygamy, polygyny, polyamory, or something like that? I mean, is there really a mating system that tends to be preferred by humans, or does it really vary so much that we can't really say that humans prefer monogamy or polygamy, for example?
That's a good question, and I think probably the answer is somewhere in between those two options. So I guess the first thing to say would be that there certainly is a lot of variation. So it's not the case that there's a one true mating system for our species, and that anything else that we do is sort of a deviation from the true evolutionary path. I think we engage in all sorts of mating-related behaviors, all the ones you named, pair bonding, polygyny, and sort of casual mating, I think, probably the three most common. People engage in all of those things. I think all of them come fairly naturally to our species. I would say, in a way, I guess the way I prefer to think about it is that mating systems are relatively indirect products of natural selection. The more direct products of natural selection are sort of psychological dispositions. So like that, we have a capacity to fall in love with one another. We have a capacity to feel jealous if other individuals get involved with the person that we're in love with. We have a capacity, if kids come along, both sexes have a capacity to love those kids, to want to care for them. We also have a desire, though, for sexual variety. Both sexes do, stronger on average in males, but there's also that. And we have various different sort of mate preferences as well that differ somewhat between the sexes. And those things are relatively directly, I would say, products of natural selection. And then we kind of culturally build mating systems around those preferences. So like I say, so we fall in love, we get jealous, we'd love to look after our kids. So one common mating system that we sort of end up with is relatively durable pair bonds, which are sort of largely exclusive, or they're supposed to be, because of this whole jealousy issue, and where if kids come along, you get biparental care of the young. On the other hand, though, we don't necessarily organise things that way. We also have this desire for sexual variety, and so sometimes we can engage in casual mating. Males, more than females, have an interest in multiple partners. Females, more than males, have an interest in sort of snagging like a high status partner. So for that reason, another option that works for some people in some cultures is polygynous mating. So you have one male with more than one female in a long-term relationship. And all those things, like none of them perfect, like all of these different things stress people out. They have their own problems. That's the case for all of them. But I think all of them come pretty naturally to us and to some degree fit quite well with our evolved sexual psychology and parental psychology. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and talking about that also, I guess that another interesting question here, and since we've been talking about biology and culture as well, is the question about evolutionary mismatch. That is, perhaps how we nowadays particularly live in environments that we ourselves created, that perhaps we are not really adapted to, or at least we are adapted to certain aspects of them and not others. So would you say that it would be possible that nowadays we are exposed to novel environmental pressures that we didn't really were exposed to during most of our evolutionary history, and that those pressures or environmental cues trigger behaviors that were not really part of our repertoire during most of our history?
Most of it, yeah. I think that's definitely the case, yeah. I think probably every day, if I made a list of all the stuff I've done today, I've done all sorts of things and I've thought about all sorts that are evolutionarily novel. So my brain evolved in a certain context, not my brain in particular, but the brain that I have as a member of the species, evolved in a certain context. We're not in that context anymore, and yet our brain, typically does a fairly good job of dealing with these novel things. So I guess when we worry about climate change, we're doing something with our brains that they weren't specifically evolved to do. When we donate to charities to help folks we've never met on the other side of the planet, we're doing something that our brains didn't specifically evolve to do. When we worry about AI, the lights coming on for AI and taking over the world and whatever else, these are all sort of evolutionary novel problems and evolutionary novel things to think about. And I think a lot of our lives are consumed with these things.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that, for example, if we were to bring someone who was part of, for example, an hunter-gatherer society into one of our modern industrial scientific societies, that, how should I say it, that perhaps the set of behaviors that were part of the repertoire of that person innately, that when that person were to be exposed to our environmental cues, that she would have something in her that would trigger behaviors that are similar to ours? I'm not sure if I'm being clear here or not.
No, I think I know what you mean, and I think the answer is yes. I think that is the case. I think that we're, approximately the same animal that we were back then, but just in a different environment. And I think, especially if that individual were brought up in our culture, they would just learn to deal with the same kind of things that we're dealing with. Because after all, a lot of these things that we are dealing with are really, really recent. And so, there's no way that we're innately equipped to deal with them specifically. We must be innately able to deal with them in a very general sense. But, those examples I gave you, like thinking about AI risk and global warming and the like, that those are very, very novel. So there's no specific innate contribution to our ability to deal with those things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but even those things like climate change and AIDS and other things like that, I mean, we only are able to properly think about them or process those kinds of information because we have something that is innate to us cognitively that really permits that to us for us to process that kind of information in those ways, right?
Well, I think so, yes. So our beta intelligence, our capacity for language, and that kind of thing, which is why human beings can think about these evolutionary novel things, whereas chimpanzees cannot, and orangutans cannot, and cats and dogs can't. So that sort of capacity for abstract cognition and our cultural capacity.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so since another big topic of your work and particularly of your first book was also religion and the relationship between religion and science and things like that, I mean, religion seems to be a fairly complex human phenomenon that has biological aspects and also cultural aspects to it. So, how would you say we should approach the study of religion?
Of religion, yeah. I think I view it as sort of, I guess, primarily a cultural phenomenon, in the sense, especially if you're looking at the specifics. So in the sense, for instance, that if you were to take an individual who had, say, Hindu parents and raise them as a Catholic, they're not going to be a Hindu, right? So they're going to be a Catholic. They're going to end up believing in one God rather than 300,000. They're going to end up believing and praying to Jesus instead of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So the level of specific beliefs, it clearly is a product of culture primarily, and I think that's important because the specific beliefs are very, very important to people. Now, if there's any innate contribution, it would have to be something quite general, much more general than these specific religious beliefs that do matter quite a bit to people. And I'm not 100% sure, I haven't yet been convinced of what that innate religious trait might be and why it's specifically religious rather than maybe something more general and broad, like a more sort of general need to have just to hold beliefs about the world or to have systems of meaning or whatever. So I think it's primarily a cultural phenomenon. The way I look at it in the book, I think, so a common question is, what's religion for? Like, what's its function? And I think there's no easy answer to that because I think really it's kind of a big mess. So different religions are just a big conglomeration of all sorts of interacting forces, the sort of net outcome of tons of different things happening all over the place. So in some cases, you have certain aspects of religion that are good for the individual. So, like, it's often said that religion is a product of wishful thinking. So it contains beliefs that help people through the tough times, help them press on when things are not going well. If a loved one dies, for instance, they can think, well, I'm going to see that individual again. So probably a product of wishful thinking. Then on the other hand, you have elements of religion that are the opposite of thinking. There's a lot of stuff in religion that's not nice at all. Right? Belief in hell, for instance, is a good example of this. It's a very it's not what you would wish to be true at all. Well, maybe people would wish hell to exist for their enemies, but for oneself and for one's loved ones, the last thing you want to think is true is hell. So that couldn't have that function. Various ideas about the kind of function that could have, so maybe a social control mechanism. People, in exactly the same way that people say, if you behave badly, Santa Claus is not going to give you any presents this year. They could do a similar thing. If you behave badly, you're going to end up going to hell. So social control comes in there, I think. I think some aspects of religion are good for the group as a whole. I think Aaron Norenzayan has made, a good case that the belief in big gods, so gods that keep an eye on people, keep a watchful eye on people, look at what they're doing, judge them morally, like that was a good action, that was a bad action, and then reward or punish them in response to these behaviours. He argues, a few other folks have argued the same thing, that belief spread through cultural group selection, and that it's kind of good for the group. It helps galvanise groups that are larger than 100 or 200 people. 100 or 200 people, we don't really need to believe in big gods or have CCTV cameras or any of those kind of things to have socially cohesive groups. When groups start getting bigger, though, you need some kind of cultural glue that helps knit groups together, and the argument is that big gods are one example of that. So yeah, so you get some stuff that's good for the individual, some stuff that's good for the group. I think also, though, you do just get a lot of stuff where you have to turn to the meme idea. There's a whole bunch of stuff in religions that I don't think you can plausibly argue. It's a bit of a stretch to argue that it's good for the individual or the group, or subgroups or whatever. Things, for instance, like folks who take a vow of celibacy and devote their entire lives to spreading the word. I think that's probably, it's good for the word. It's better for the word than it is for them. It's helping the religious beliefs propagate themselves much more than it's helping them or necessarily helping the group. Similar argument could be made for martyrdom. Lots of things like that. I think the aspects of religion that are just like the equivalent of earworms. They're sort of catchy memes that just propagate themselves independently of whether they're good or bad for us. And that's what religion is, I think, just a big conglomeration of all these different things with all these different functions.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that in the specific case of celibacy that it would be possible that people who are celibates would gain something in terms of inclusive fitness if they were to dismiss their own reproductive success and perhaps invest in other people that are genetically related to them?
Yeah, so it could enhance indirect fitness. I think it's possible, but I think you'd have to do a lot of work to make the case that has actually evolved. I mean, for a start, it's a very rare phenomenon. So I think it's implausible to suggest that it's something that we've specifically evolved to do. So I think, it's quite unlikely because it's so rare. And you'd also have to make the case, if you were to go down that path, you'd have to make the case that folks who do that take a vow of celibacy and help close relatives to have kin, that would be a better option than having offspring of their own. And that's a bit of a hard sell, because usually your best way to enhance your inclusive fitness in our species is to have offspring of your own. And then finally, you'd have to look at what they actually spend their time doing. And I think when they become celibate, I think like celibate monks and that kind of thing, I imagine that they don't spend all their time looking after close relatives. I imagine that a lot of the activities that they get involved with are religious activities that do a lot more to promote the religion than to help their close kin have offspring. So possible, yes, but I think probably it's not the case.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the innate aspects of religion, would you agree with the approach that some people have as to religion being a byproduct of several different adaptations of our mind? Like, for example, core knowledge that includes theory of mind, folk physics, folk biology, and also our teleological thinking and our hyperactive agent detection device and a lot of other stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of approach I think is best. I think that religious memes do emerge out of human nature and they have to mesh with human nature. And that list that you gave, those are the kind of things, the kind of aspects of human nature that give rise to religious thoughts. And religious thoughts, why do they spread? Because they mesh quite nicely with those aspects of human nature. Our tendency to anthropomorphize, hyperactive agency detection system. I probably think of that just in terms of just theory of mind. It's not something separate from theory of mind, but just our tendency to overextend theory of mind and sort of trying to explain events in the natural world and things like that come out of we just more naturally gravitate toward explaining it in terms of agents like ourselves doing things deliberately with goals in mind. I think also just our intelligence and our abstract understanding opens the door to religion for us in a way that it doesn't for other animals. Just because we have this ability to think thoughts like, what are we doing here? Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing, etc.? And so we have these questions that other animals don't have, so that they don't need the answers for them. But we ask these questions, and then we have a gap, and we try to fill in that gap in various different kind of ways, including with religious answers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. We've been talking a lot about biology and culture and the relationship between them, and also gene-culture coevolution. But at a certain point in your book, The Ape That Understood the Universe, you say that culture might influence our behavior a bit, but it never conjures things up, nor is the origin of them. So could we just end up with you explaining a little bit more what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, actually, no, I do think that culture does have quite a big impact on us in a lot of areas. So what I meant, like a few places in the book, I talk about that. I talk about how certain things are not conjured up out of nothing by culture. I didn't so much mean that as just a general statement about every single domain of culture.
Right.
I meant more about the specific things, like specific sex differences, for instance, specific tendencies like our tendency to favour kin over non-kin and close kin over more distant kin. So in those particular cases, I guess I really just meant that it's not all down to culture. So it's not the case that there's no innate push at all within those domains, and that it all is just conjured up out of nothing by culture. I was sort of just arguing that because of all the evidence that suggests that there is an innate contribution, that we have to conclude that it's influenced by nurture, but that nurture doesn't invent it just out of thin air.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. Okay, so Dr. Stewart-Williams, just before we go, apart from your books, for which I will be leaving links in the description box of the video, are there any good places on the internet if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
Yep, I'll name two. So I have a web page that I tend to keep up to date. Not sure if it is at the moment, but that's, I believe that's stevestewart-williams.com. So Steve, Stewart Williams, no full stops or anything between them, or just run on. And the other place would be Twitter. So my Twitter handle is @SteveStewWill, SteveStuWill, @SteveStewWill.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will include that in the description box of this interview. And so, Dr. Stewart-Williams, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show. It was really an interesting conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me again, and thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Hi guys, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end. I'm recording a new ending just to let you know a couple of new things, but I mean, I've started this channel in February 2018 and I've been putting out a lot of interviews with academics and intellectuals. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And if you don't like Patreon or prefer other platforms, you can also go to PayPal and subscribe from $1 to $20. I have all of those options in the description box of the video, and you can also make a one-time donation on PayPal. And also you can go to Subscribestar and pledge any amount there, so you have all of those options to support the channel. And so before I go, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, and I'm very proud of this, my first producer, Izar Webb. Thank you for all.